But either way, welcome to the NYPDL second practice for our home team. This program was made to be able to provide an opportunity for those that either don't have a team at their school or need extra support to get that support with experienced debaters that have done things, cool things, etc. My name is Ariel Segura. I am the Director of Onboarding and Outreach at the NYPDL for this current school year, but I also happen to be the director of the Parliamentary Debate Team at Brooklyn Tech. Uh, I am not an expert at parliamentary debate, and I am for sure able to admit that. But I am ho fortunately, what I'd like to say, good enough to be able to teach others, to use my knowledge to teach others. In this past year, in the 24-25 season, I had the opportunity to break multiple times and to even compete in the National Tournament of Champions. Super cool experience. So hopefully my knowledge is able to be something of a resource for you, especially in this very important lecture, which is casing, which is just setting up a round, setting up your side's debate within those 15 minutes for you to have a successful debate round. Let's just get straight into this lecture. I won't lie. Um, there are two main parts of your case. There is the top of case, which is really overviews, definitions, frameworks, things that need to be applied to almost every part of the debate. Then there are contentions, which are the actual arguments themselves that you're making within the rounds, the actual things that the judges are to adjudicate on. In this lecture, we're going to break both of these parts down, talk about what you're supposed to do, how you're supposed to do them, how you make decisions, etc., for you to have a successful debate round. There are three main parts to your top of case. There are definitions, there are frameworks, and there are overviews. Your definitions are really defining those key terms, right? What do the words in the motion even mean, right? If there is a vague word in the motion, what does that mean? How does that apply to our motion? How does that limit the scope of debate, right? We can't debate everything that exists in the world in one hour and 30-minute round. So because of that, we have to limit ourselves, we have to narrow ourselves to give ourselves a debate that works for all, that a debate that really talks about something to the extent that you learn something. As well, there is a part called your framework. This is really the way that your judge decides how the round is won. It's also known as a weighing mechanism. It's it's the establishment of a value criterion that decides important things within the round, right? What's important, and by the end of the round, the judge ought to decide the round by saying that the side that promotes this important value, this important criterion the most, ought to win. So if your framework is net benefits, which we'll talk about in a second, then the sides that best promotes benefits for all, a positive amount of benefits for all, ought to win the round if the judge is adjudicating properly. Lastly, there is something called your overviews. It is deciding important, kind of like more minuscule facts that are important to the round, right? Things that apply to the round as a whole. So if it's explaining a characteristic of a person, if it's explaining why a person wants to do something, why something would work, how something would work, those are done in your overviews. So let's get into these three parts. Your definitions, really, what, when, how. They're clear explanation of the terms in the resolution. You want to establish the scope of the debate when you are establishing your definitions. You use your definitions by introducing them in the first speech that you have. If you're on the government side, it's your responsibility to establish those definitions. So what does that mean? It means that in the beginning of the Prime Minister Constructive, you define your motions. Pretty simple, right? Lastly, once again, this point the reasoning, the motivation of definitions is to ensure clarity because you can't debate everything, right? You want to make sure that your definitions are fair and predictable so that you actually have a debate round. If you set your definitions as something unpredictable, chance is one side didn't prepare for it, and now we're in this side where we're in this debate where two sides are debating two different things because definitions were not set fairly. The Gov once again has special powers because they have the ability to argue for an action, but as well, they have the ability to define the terms in the motion. But as I just said, it's very possible. The opposition can skew the debate. They can say, hey, not the opposition, the government can skew the debate and say, hey, I actually want to set it to this very unpredictable set of definitions. Then the opposition, to ensure that there's a balance of power, is able to contest them for being abusive and argue them as if they were arguments presented within the round. As well, if the government fails to define something, the opposition has the right to define that thing instead. Here are a few acronyms to remember. This house would, this house supports, this house believes that, and this house regrets that. Within a round, it is important that you know these because your motions are always going to be starting with one of these four different, I guess, principles or acronyms. It'll always be this house would, insert action. This house supports either insert action, insert trend, insert some sort of thing that a person is able to support, etc. Right? Pretty simple things. Few things. So there are a set of definitions that are normative for a debate round, that you'll typically see, such as a rational actor, such as society, such as net benefits for the framework, right? There are a few rules that you should generally follow when defining to ensure that you don't end up being an abusive debater, but also to just ensure that you have a fun round, right? So first, when you're looking at emotion, you want to determine is that motion is what the house is defined in the motion. If the house is defined in the motion, then boom, you're done. You don't have to define this house, right? But then, let's say it's not, which is a lot of situations. Then you have to ask yourself whether or not it's asking whether or not the house would do something, right? This house would. We just talked about this, right? If it is doing that, then you have to ask yourself, are we making a personal decision or a policy decision, right? So are we making a decision for ourselves for a life simulation that we're going to debate, or are we making a decision for some sort of policy or legislature or government related task, right? If it's a personal decision, then this house should be set as the person that would make the decision. While if it's a policy decision, the house should be a person, group, body, someone with power that is able to enact that policy. Let's say this house isn't doing something though. Then this house is typically a rational actor. Because to have a fair debate regarding some sort of belief, you have to come from what is a rational, what is a unbiased perspective. And that is establishing a debate round by arguing that the house is a rational actor. Because then you're reflecting society, which does not have one set of bias. It just has logic and fact. Here's once again what we just had, what we just looked at close up. Within a round, you ought to define this house. You ought to define important terms in the motion that aren't contextual, and you ought to define some terms that could be important to the round. So sometimes this has to do with broader terms, right? So we have three motions below. This house believes that schools should prioritize modern popular literature over classics. This house would have minimum quotas for different ethnic groups living in public housing estates, and this house would institute congressional term limits. What do you guys think we ought to define from all of these motions? Let's start with this first one, right? This house believes schools should prioritize modern popular literature over classics. Does anyone know what we automatically define almost in every single motion? Feel free to unmute or put it in the chat.
The U.S. federal government.
The U.S. federal government could indeed be defined here. And this house definitely should be defined as some sort of legislative of body, right? Because you're believing, well, sorry, I just tripped over my own words and realized if we aren't necessarily, I'm looking at this first motion here. For the other ones, it's definitely possible. But in this first motion, we're believing something. We're not necessarily enacting something, right? So, what in that situation should we define this house as?
This house?
Yeah, this house, what should we define it as?
Um,
We have this chart here. We know that this house isn't defined, and we know that this house isn't doing something. What does this house automatically truly get assigned as?
A rational actor?
Indeed, it is. So, in this situation, since we're believing something, it should be a rational actor. While in the other two motions, since we're taking some sort of action that is legislative, it should be some sort of legislative body that has the power to actually enact these things. Um, in this first motion here, right, we also want to define important terms that aren't contextual, right? What do we think here is a little bit vague? What do we not necessarily understand immediately after reading in this first motion, right? We have schools should prioritize modern popular literature over classics. What do we think? I don't think schools is necessarily a vague term, right? Typically, people understand that. It could be defined though, what type of school? Is it high school, middle school, elementary school? Should definitely should not be defined. It's a pretty basic term. It's just there to make the sentence grammatical. Prioritized. That's a term that may be important to the round, but doesn't necessarily need some sort of contextualization. I think everyone understands what to prioritize means. While modern popular literature, I don't know about you guys, I'm looking at that and I likely will get confused. What does it mean for literature to be modern and popular? Does it mean it was released in the 2000s? Does it mean it was released in the 1950s? That's a differentiation someone ought to make. Same with classics, right? Classics is used in a lot of places. We have classic music, we have classic literature, we have classic art, right? What does that mean, though? Does that mean we're referring to the 20th century? Does that mean we're referring to the 12th century, right? These are questions that we ought to answer, and we do that with our definitions. In the rest of the motions, we would end up defining what a minimum quota is. We would end up defining what a different ethnic group is. And we would end up defining what a public housing estate is. Why? Because these are all important to debate. And same with this last part, right? We don't need to define institute, but what is a congressional term limit? We have to answer these questions to ensure that we can debate. Yep. So, let's do a little bit more of an activity, force you guys to talk just a little bit more, right? Let's talk about it just a little bit. We have a motion here. This house would let children take more than one candy from bowls on Halloween. And we have all of these options to as to what this house could be. We have this house could be a kid dressing up for Halloween. This house could be the US government. This house could be a person putting out a bowl on Halloween. This house could be candy manufacturers, or this house could be a rational actor, right? So this house could really be anything here. We know that this house is taking an action, so it wouldn't be a rational actor, but it'd rather be a person taking this action, right? So what do you guys think? What do we think about this first one here? A. Do we think this house is fair to be set as a kid dressing up for Halloween? Do we think that's abusive or do we think that's weird? Feel free to put it in the chat as well.
It's kind of abusive because
Yeah, indeed it is. It's definitely abusive. We can see that if a child is the one taking candy, while a child be the one deciding whether or not they can make these decisions. What about the US government? Is it fair, abusive, or weird? Weird indeed it is, right? At least I don't typically see government officials giving out candy as the government. Typically, government officials give out candy maybe on their personal life, right? But not as one legislative body, right? Next, a person putting out a bowl of candy, bowl on Halloween. What do we think? Fair, weird, or abusive? Fair indeed it is. This is the person taking the action, right? If it's your bowl, you have jurisdiction to decide what happens with your bowl. And in that situation, you can say, hey, I don't want you to take more than one candy. Or I do want you to take more than one candy. They are able to decide this. D, candy manufacturers. Is that fair, abusive, or weird? This is a interesting one. Weird, okay. Any fair? Interesting. it could even said that it could be said that this is abusive, maybe even, right? Uh, Candy manufacturers want to make money. And if kids take more candy, they make more money because more candy is bought, right? It could also be seen as weird though, because they don't actually have the right to decide whether or not these anything truly regarding these bowls of candy. They can't decide whether or not kids are taking one or two. They can't even put out this bowl of candy because they are a candy manufacturer, right? Lastly, could this house be defined as a rational actor? Is that fair, abusive, or weird? I would also say this is fair, right? A rational actor would make a rational decision about whether or not kids can take more than one candy from bowls on Halloween. Next, on this other motion, this house believes fines should be proportional to the offender's income. Could this house be defined as low income people? Is that fair, abusive, or weird? Fair? For that one, it could be said that that's fair because a low income person could believe this. But technically, a low income person has a irrational belief because if they are making less money, they believe that they should keep more of that money, right? So that view might be a little skewed. That'd likely fall under abusive, if not weird. Next, the US government. Is that fair, weird, or abusive? Fair. Okay. In this situation, the US federal government could indeed believe this, right? They could establish a resolution that says that they are in accordance with fines being proportional to an offender's income. It's just a little weird because typically the US federal government is not constructed of belief, right? They're rather constructed of action and legislative policy and whatever the executive branch wants to do, right? Criminals, as this house for this motion. Is that fair, abusive, or weird? Abusive indeed. Weird also, truly, because a criminal is the one getting this fine, right? So if that's the case, why should they be able to decide what fine they get? Lastly, irrational actors ended off strong. Fair, weird, or abusive. Fair indeed it is. A rational actor has the right to believe. And typically when we're believing something, because a rational actor represents the mix of beliefs we have in society, we then are able to set it up and have a fair debate round with it. For this first one, it was a kid dressing up for Halloween abusive, the US federal government as weird. A kid putting out a bowl of candy on, a person pulling out a bowl of candy on Halloween fair. Candy manufacturers weird and rational actors fair. Well, for this other one, it's abusive, weird, weird or abusive, and fair. Next, we have the ability to come up with our own definitions. Very fun to see. Let's say we had the motion, this house regrets the narrative that lying is immoral. Within a round, obviously, the first thing that you do when you start that prep is set those definitions. So, what do you guys think are some definitions for the following motion? Could each of you take the moment to just in chat write a definition for each word that you guys think is crucial for the actual debate round? You can set some time for that. This house indeed could be set as a rational actor, right? A rational actor is able to regret. Narrative, a lesson taught through media or through education. Very much so. It is a lesson that's carried through centuries. We see this with the Big Bad Wolf and Robin Hood and truly honestly, almost every story tries to carry Yep, some sort of story. And immoral is indeed not accepted morally. And I want to point out about the definition for immoral, it doesn't necessarily mean like it's not that people don't understand what immorality is. It's just that it's an important term for the rounds. It's probably good to set up. Now, there's just one last word. If I were you guys, I'd define lying. Uh But the slideshow disagrees with me. The slideshow would have only defined this house and immoral. To be fair, right? We see the word narrative in many debate motions, and what a narrative is generally understood. We also know that lying is truly misinformation, right? It's information that's given that isn't true. It's false, right? So these two things are understood pretty normatively by society. In moral, that could mean a lot of things for a lot of different people, right? So that definitely should be defined. Let's try one last example. This house believes that SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States, should be abolished. You guys want to take the second and chat to do that as well? This house as a rational actor would be fairly reasonable. Once again, we're believing, we're not enacting. What do we think for the rest of the motion? Do we think only this house? Abolish to get rid of something. Very much so. Now, I have no idea what the slideshow is about to say, but it could either say that A, we need to define what SCOTUS means, or B, we don't. But definitely this house believes that and abolished. Never mind, not even abolished. I disagree with the slideshow here. I think to abolish something is something that should be clarified. It could mean to be taken away. It could mean that it could return, right? Are you getting rid of it forever or are you getting rid of it temporarily? These are decisions that have to be made. Something I want to point out about this motion is that it's recommending that you optimally choose for this house a rational American citizen or a average American citizen, and this is because a rational actor from who knows some mm, Thailand, right, or the Philippines or really anything, right, might not necessarily know or understand the Supreme Court of the United States, so they might not be able to properly decide upon this. A rational actor, though, in consciousness, if making this belief, would be educated. So it would be fine if you said a rational actor. But to specify, it could be said a rational American citizen. Now, sometimes you want to define more than just the terms, right? If you are doing something within a round, you ought to set up something called a plan. For example, if the motion is this house would increase military funding to Ukraine, and the op could say that giving money to Ukraine decreases the amount of money we have to spend on welfare and it would raise taxes, right? But it's assuming that you're taking money straight from taxes and that's taking money straight from welfare, right? It's assuming that the automatic response is to raise your taxes, right? Um, but to preempt that, you establish a plan. And you could say that the money is coming from existing military budget and not necessarily out of any other government services. That is one part of our many definitions that we have to establish. Next, we have our framework. Once again, the framework is the standard as to how the judge is supposed to interpret and adjudicate the round. The government introduces their framework in the first speech. Similar to definitions, if the government introduces an abusive framework, it is able to be knocked down and provided an alternate. For example, if you have the motion this house would legalize gambling, a few definitions would probably be that this house would be the U.S. federal government. Um, any plausible framework as a result of this could be setting net benefits for U.S. citizens or util for U.S. citizens, right? To use a framework, you have to realize that your arguments ought to revolve around this framework, right? Because if the judge is deciding, hey, whichever side supports this idea, this value, this criteria best should win the round, then you want to make sure that all of your arguments follow this criteria, this value, this the idea that exists in society. To define the two common frameworks that we see right here in the slide, net benefits, simply put, is the positive benefits that US citizens get, right? You think about it like math, right? 5 minus 5 equals 4. It's still positive. While 3 minus 5 equals negative 2. That's negative, right? You want to see what's the net benefit is, right? What is that final number? Is it in the positive? Is it in the negative? The government is going to argue that the opposition has a negative number. The opposition is going to argue that the government has a negative number. While the gov should be attempting to argue, yes, we are in the positive. Yes, we have a positive number. And the op does the same. Um, Truly, the reason why net benefits is useful is because you're able to concede that there is some sort of bad. You're able to say, sure, this badness does happen, but it's better than the opposition world. For utilitarianism, it is simply saying, and nothing more, that you are rooting for the happiness for the most amount of people. That is it. Often, utilitarianism gets confused for net benefits, but that isn't the case. Utilitarianism and net benefits are two different things. Net benefits on a holistic evaluation, while utilitarianism only evaluates happiness. Overviews. Let's get straight into it. An overview is a piece of information that you state after your definitions and after your framework and before your case. It's the last thing is kind of preempting your arguments, right? There are a few things that you typically want to provide in your overview. You want to provide factual pieces of information that frame the round, right? It's good to get this out of the way so you don't have to repeat it. It's often about the world that you're in, what the world looks like, it's characterizing it. But as well, you don't often apply these things directly to these arguments. Like to say this and to spend an entire chunk of your argument establishing this general fact is typically redundant when you set up an overview. It's better for the judge to hear this, especially since anything mentioned in the beginning and in the end of any speech is better remembered. But as well, it allows for you to bring up multiple pieces of warranting that apply to multiple arguments, right? It's to reduce redundancy, right? To ensure that you are maximizing the amount of words you have in your overview, you're able to set up larger ideas that the judge should keep in mind for the rest of the rounds, right? So let's come up with some overviews. Let's say we have the motion, this House believes all candidates running for president should be given an equal amount of taxpayer money to fund their campaigns instead of raising money themselves. The first question I propose to you guys is how do presidents currently fund their campaigns? Does anyone know? It's actually a pretty big story in the news currently. Donations indeed. And these donations, they come from both people, but they also come from these things called PACs, political action. I forget if it was action or advisory committees, but they raise money sometimes for these people and then they donate it to them. Um, right. So then the next question is, how is taxpayer money accrued, right? That's a pretty basic question, but it's definitely something useful to set up and around. How do you get your taxpayer money? Who are taxpayers? What do you guys think? I mean, the pretty basic answer here is simply that a taxpayer is a person that's going to be charged money, right? Um, we currently know that they raise money themselves. That could be something useful to mention. Is there any other kind of notion about presidents and their campaigns and maybe about equity or inequity, right? Why do we want to set this as an equal amount? Why, what could ever be the motivation for this? Any ideas, guys? Very much so. So everyone has a fair chance at running. And really what you want to establish is that in the current world there isn't a fair way for everyone to run. Let's see what the motion gives us. So the motion currently sets up that the on the government side, that currently candidates get money from super PACs and rich people. They get those donations. They're influenced by these donations, and that many voters typically go for the more famous candidates. That's a very good point. The opposition side says that the majority of candidate funding comes from their party and their support. Thus, the funds they receive are proportional to how good of a candidate they are, and instead means that supporters won't be able to donate like they would. These are really good things to set up for the rounds, right? You're establishing the current world. You're establishing how the emotion affects the current world. You're establishing why the current world might want to be changed or why not, right? You have all of these ideas brought up. Next and lastly on well actually no, not lastly. These are all of our slides regarding the overview of a contention. Any questions, guys? Any at all? Speak now, forever hold your peace. All right, we're holding peace then. The next thing in the slideshow is talking about the actual arguments that you're making. And by making the arguments, you of course have to follow a structure, kind of like you do in school, right? When you're answering a short answer question for a history class or making an argumentative essay and making a body paragraph, you always have that topic, sentence, that evidence, and that analysis, right? A contention, very similar to any of those argumentative things, is one of the arguments that you make in a round that affirm or negate the motion. Typically, you'll make 2 to 4 of these within your 15-minute span. And they're set up very similar. Once again, you're setting up that claim, that warrant, and that impact. In the real world, you have things like a topic sentence, evidence, and analysis. We, since we're primarily using logic and not using research, are instead using just a topic sentence, a claim, a summarizing sentence, a warrant that logically explains our argument, and impacting the outcome, right? Why any of this matters. Let's get into it, right? A claim is the tagline to one of your central arguments. It's really, once again, this topic sentence. Our first contention is that a ban on cigarettes would lead to decreased cancer rates. Very simple, very petite, right? You don't want to make it too long. You just want to summarize your argument. Your warrant is why your claim is actually true. It is a logical construction used built up of analysis, built up of examples, and built up of evidence to prove your argument, right? You do this by creating a link chain, linking the claim to your argument, right? So if a federal ban on cigarettes would lead to decreased cancer rates, you have to explain that, right? You'd say that smoking is known to cause lung cancer, that if the federal government bans cigarettes, people aren't able to smoke anymore. You see how that jump was very smallly made, right? You're going from smoking, right, and you're smoking with cigarettes to if you ban cigarettes, you can't smoke anymore. It's such a small logical jump. You're not going from smoking is known to cause lung cancer. For that reason, you're getting less lung cancer, right? You're saying smoking is known to cause lung cancer, and that when you ban it, you people can't smoke anymore. And since they can't smoke anymore, they'll smoke less, and they'll procure less lung cancer, right? That's a link chain. Your last part of a contention, and very much so the most important part of a contention is your impact. It is arguing why any of the analysis that you provided is important, and it's looking at your contentions in the real world. This is typically where a contention, an argument, and truly some rounds are voted upon. Some impacts include decreased cancer, less deaths, longer lives, less medical bills, less burden on hospitals, happier people, and less suffering. These are all definitely potential impacts, but some impacts are stronger than others within rounds. Which impacts do you think qualify to go under a strong column, and which do you think qualify to go under a weak column? Why don't you guys, as I list them out, put a S or a W in chat? Decreased cancer, strong or weak? I agree. Decreased cancer is a pretty strong impact. Less death, strong or weak? Strong indeed. It is a terminal impact. It is a final thing, right? There's nothing much more than it. Longer lives, strong or weak? I would agree too. It is a strong thing to have a longer life. You're expanding life. That means you're preventing death. Really, death is included under this impact of having a longer life. Next, less medical bills, strong or weak? I would say for the less medical bills, it would likely fall more under weak, right? Especially in comparison to some of these other impacts that we're seeing present within and around. If we're arguing against decreasing cancer and decreasing death, your medical bills don't play that big of a role. Less burden on hospitals, strong or weak? Strong indeed, right? There are a few logical things to build from having less burden on hospitals. It means that you have less deaths. It means that you have more control of certain situations, right? Etc., etc. It means people are able to be healthier and live better lives, right? All of these things that are being solved because hospitals are not being burdened. Happier people, strong or weak? Weak indeed, right? In comparison to all these other impacts, they're probably not as persuasive as suffering less. Lastly, well, not really as suffering less, but as compared to dying and as compared to living a longer life and decreasing cancer. Last one, less suffering, right? What do we think? Strong or weak? Really, it could be both, right? It depends what this idea of suffering means. But since the impact by itself is vague, it probably isn't the strongest. I'd qualify it under weak. Now, let's look at this example, and I'll present this like a speech, right? We have a claim, we have a warrant, and we have an impact. My first contention is that raising interest rates will cause numerous workers to lose their jobs. When the Federal Reserve raises their interest rates, people spend less money. This means that there's less stimulation in the economy because people are buying less products. Now, companies are losing money from not collecting revenue, but also losing the need for workers, right? We see that less people are making money. We see that there's less money going into companies. Less workers means less product, means less things to sell, means less money, right? But as well, we see that a decreased need for workers leads to thousands of workers being laid off. The impacts of this contention is that when people lose their jobs and they have less money, it causes an increase in poverty where people can't afford basic necessities like food and housing. And on a larger scale, my impact truly is that homelessness increases. That is a claim or an impact that should be presented with and around. It likely should have more examples here. Humanizes the debate just a little more. So let's say you're in a round and you really need to come up with some arguments. Here are a few tips. First, ask yourself, who are the different actors in this motion, right? Is this motion affecting kids, adults? Is it affecting students, workers, government workers? Public transport workers, right? Ask yourself like what specific groups, right? Next, ask yourself what actors are involved, right? For example, if this motion, this House believes that religious leaders should not endorse candidates for political office, um, well, this isn't a new thing. This is the first idea, right? We would say that supporters of religious leaders, we would say that religious leaders themselves, politicians themselves, and voters themselves are affected. And we see even there are much more subgroups that you can think about. The next thing that you should think of when coming up with material are different places. What's the scope? Is it only affecting the United States of America, or is it affecting the entire NATO organization? Or is it an international effect, right? Consider these things. Next, examine a comparative. What is a reasonable alternative to the motion? What is a better idea, right? So if you're debating about sanctions, you could say that a reasonable alternative is military intervention. You could also consider political, economic rights, morals, social values, right? What values are at stake? If you're debating about the liberty of someone, that means freedom is probably at stake. Is justice at stake? You have all of these questions. Ask yourself, how are they defined within the motion? Now, my computer's dying, so give me just 2 seconds. Right. And the last thing that should be considered within a round is what stories can you tell? And I think truly this is one of the most underrated parts that aren't considered when prepping for a round. This is specifically because what we see in a day-to-day basis when we are participating in rounds is that a lot of people are affected by the emotions presented. If you're able to tell a story, you're able to truly deliver the impacts that you want to. Now, I believe this is the end of the slideshow. Yes, that is all 31 slides. So I'm going to stop this recording and we are going to get into a